Hey there, my name is Charlie Evert, and today we are going to be going over working with strategy models. Before I get into the table of contents, I wanted to introduce myself. I currently live in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania in the United States. I grew up in St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands, and I'm currently working as a data engineer for a pretty large healthcare company. So feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn if you like this lecture. But without further ado, let's get into it. Going over what we're going to be covering today, we are looking at what are strategy models, how are they used. Then we're going to be comparing logic models versus theory of change. We're going to be looking at a theory of change example, a logic model example, and then project model assumptions and project model constraints, followed by a discussion and a brief wrap-up. So, strategy models. What are they? We are going to go into the definitions first. A strategy model is a tool that helps entities develop action plans. You really need to look at strategy as attempting to achieve a goal through measured actions. So defining a strategy itself, a sought-after goal, along with the actions needed to attain it. You can't simply say, I want to win a gold medal in the Olympics swimming. You have to have a strategy. You have to say, I'm going to be swimming this amount of days, and due to this effort that I'm putting in, this is what I expect to achieve through these tactical actions. Leading into action plans, which tactics or steps to do in order to achieve a given strategy. And then a logic model is what are the inputs, outputs, and outcomes of a plan. It is really just logically mapping through what should a plan be. What should a program look like to address a given issue and meet an organizational objective? Meet or exceed it, really. A theory of change is why or how a change is expected to occur. It's essentially mapping out the logic behind it. If there is a fire, it's probable that a building that is on fire is going to continue to catch fire. I think that's a pretty solid theory of change. Most people would back it up. If you put salmon in the oven at 350 degrees, it will eventually cook. We expect that to occur, therefore it's a pretty solid theory of change. But we'll get into what makes up a strong theory of change and what makes up a weak theory of change in a little bit. Now we're going to be looking at theory of change specifically. A good theory of change does the following. It explains why a program should succeed. As we were talking about that salmon in the oven, it should succeed because in the past we've observed similar actions that have happened. It defines the problem at hand and the change strategy. It highlights the factors that may influence the change process. Perhaps we're at a higher altitude, that salmon might take a little bit longer or shorter to bake based on that. It identifies plausible solutions and assumptions. So what are we assuming? That if you apply heat to a salmon, that salmon will be cooked. And then we work as a basis for a thorough logic model. Logic models don't necessarily require a theory of change, but I believe that it is a great practice that a theory of change drives a sound logic model. Because if you look at what a logic model really is, which we'll get into a little bit later, you're really looking at driving change. So if you don't know why that change would occur, then perhaps it's not the best logic model. Perhaps you need to start over, scrap it, actually get a better theory of change to begin. But going forward, we're looking at logic models specifically. But before we get into that, I want to define what a KPI is. It is a key performance indicator, which essentially measures meaningful performance metrics. For instance, am I meeting sales goals? You might be able to measure that based on the amount of revenue that each salesperson brings in. Comparing each salesperson apples to apples based on the revenue they bring in would be a pretty strong key performance indicator. Is that salesperson successful? Well, we can see based on the amount of sales that they're actually making. But I digress. As we go in, logic models help to communicate to program stakeholders by documenting outcomes, actions, and justifications for actions, aka the theory of change that we just spoke about. Identifying necessary KPIs to measure performance tracking, like we were just talking about, those revenue goals for each salesperson, and identifying what went wrong with previous models or projects. A great tool to use for strategy models is just iteration. If you have a strategy model and it is successful, perhaps you can really build on that for the next strategy model. If it's not so successful, what can you take away from it, essentially? And also improving future projects based on past successes or failures, like I had just been talking about. So what makes a good logic model? Logic models flow sequentially over time and have unique appearances. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. These models operate on key assumptions and constraints, as we will talk about towards the end of this. But essentially, every logic model, you're going to assume, hey, if we put the salmon in the oven at 350 degrees, it should cook. That's an assumption. A constraint is, do we even have the salmon? Do we have the money to purchase salmon? Do we have the oven to put it in? Those are some examples of some constraints that you have to think of as well. Because you really can't address a strategy model without an actual plan of action. And you can't even begin a plan of action if you don't have all the necessary equipment, time, and resources to do so. So assumptions and constraints should be reasonable. You shouldn't say, I need $1 million to do to sharpen a pencil, for instance. That's completely unreasonable. If someone was to just say, hey, just go sharpen a pencil, you could probably do it in 30 seconds. There's no reason that would cost $1 million. On the opposite side of the spectrum, for something that's extremely reasonable, if you said, hey, go sharpen this pencil, can you bring it back in maybe 10 minutes? That's completely reasonable. It's just, it really depends on the situation itself. And we'll go over some examples in subsequent slides. So only the resources and activities outlined in a model can be controlled. And the theory of change must be a strong basis for change, as we had talked about earlier. I put that in bold because if there isn't a strong theory of change, then why are we even really mapping out a logic model? If some actions will not logically influence some outcomes, then what is the point of a given program if it's not going to be meeting those objectives? So this is the basic format of most logic models. You have resources and activities, which are things that you can control. I highlighted them as work. And then you have the actual results of the work that you put in, the outputs, the outcomes, and the impact. And we'll go over that more thoroughly in the future. But essentially, resources are what you have, what is constraining you. The activities or the actions is what you're going to be doing. The outputs are what you expect to see from performing given activities. Outcomes are really the long-term outputs of a given activity. And then the impact, how does it measure up to the goals at hand? This is the program lifecycle stages and how they tie in with strategy models. So logic models help organize the program lifecycle, which includes the design phase, where you need to clearly communicate the program concepts and approach to each stakeholder. Implementation, where you monitor collected data to prioritize, adjust, and improve. And evaluation, where you monitor progress towards goals and program effectiveness. As you can see, these really flow sequentially. You're not going to really start implementing a project until you have a thorough design, until you have a thorough logic model, essentially. And then you have to know, how is that logic model going to be evaluated and how is it going to be actually implemented? And if you don't have each of these three elements, then it could be a very weak strategy model. And it's not really going to be as useful as it can be. So logic model success measurement. The following describe how a logic model can be considered a success. The model clearly articulates goals and objectives. The goals and objectives are realistic and obtainable, and KPIs can be effectively measured and obtained. Additionally, stakeholders can modify the program based on performance, essentially pivoting the program if it's not being effective in the actions that are being taken. And then potential stakeholder questions are addressed by the model. You're essentially trying to anticipate what would stakeholders ask of this model. What are they going to object to it? Are the constraints unrealistic? Are the actions not backed up by the constraints? Are all assumptions reasonable? That's really why a strong theory of change ties into everything so well. Some use cases of strategy models. So strategy models are ideal for mapping out complex strategies by understanding the potential gaps in a strategy through diagramming. You really can't see a lot of these weaknesses unless they're all put out in front of you, until someone can ask a question, hey, why are you just going to put the salmon on your dashboard, for instance, in your car dashboard and let it cook? If it's really cold out, perhaps it's not going to cook. If it's really, really hot out, suppose you're in the desert, maybe it will cook. But you're not going to see that potential gap until you actually diagram it out. That salmon strategy, I think it's kind of weak and it's getting kind of old and it won't really pull that out again. But I think it really goes to show and illustrate the point. There's always going to be some gap in a strategy, and until everybody can really see those gaps, they can't really be addressed. So that's why these logic models are very important for program management. Visualizing and helping to communicate to multiple stakeholders is also another benefit. Solidifying the vision of the project with expected outcomes and KPIs, as well as highlighting changes from previous strategies at a glance. Key stakeholders. First, we're going to define a stakeholder. I've mentioned them a few times, but a stakeholder is an entity that is affected by the program or a project. Perhaps it's the program manager that is clearly affected and is driving the change, and the effect on the program manager, if the project goes well, is perhaps they get a favorable review, perhaps they get a raise, perhaps they just make more friends that way. It's always good to have a successful project. A stakeholder could also be a financial backer. So financial backers may use strategy models to make investment decisions. They may look at a strategy model and ask questions such as, will this program be beneficial compared to the capital spent? Capital meaning money. If an investor says, hey, perhaps we can help rhinos repopulate and cease to be an endangered species by investing $1 million, that might be a worthy investment for them. But if they see someone say, hey, please donate just to help raise rhino endangerment awareness, that might not be as useful as a project, especially if the money is apples to apples, the same amount. So really, a strategy model and a logic model can really help to benefit financial backers, program managers, people that participate in programs, the general public, and whoever is actually benefiting from these programs. Program managers can keep team members accountable for actions, which is another key benefit of a strategy model. Teams can be evaluated based on meeting KPIs. As I mentioned before, sales targets are an instance of this. There's also just general performance. Suppose someone is looking at a worker in an Amazon factory. How fast are they assembling orders and then shipping them out the door? Strategy models provide info to plan, evaluate, and improve programs. Key approaches. There are three main approaches to logic models. Theory. The theory of change influences the design the most. You're looking at the big picture here, and when you're building a strategy model based on theory overall, you're really just looking at, can I meet this theory of change? Can I spark entropy in some way? When you're looking at the outcome, you're really looking at the goal itself. So the desired results influence the design. I want rhinos to not be extinct, let's say. You're looking at the long-term impacts over all else, and you're trying to adjust the actions and every other component of the strategy model to really reflect that. As opposed to the activities, where you're looking at the detailed specifics that influence the design of the strategy model the most. You're looking at detailed focused designs. You're looking at the actions from a really detailed level instead of high level big picture thinking. So no single approach is standard, but a good model could use all three approaches. It doesn't necessarily have to, especially if it's a very large issue. But the best models are the most specific from what I've found. A strong basis for the possibility of change. Logic models are best when driven by a strong theory of change, as we discussed before. Logic models outline programs that should achieve their goals. If there is a strong logical basis that some actions will drive some change, and then those actions are taken, that change should be achieved. An example of a strong theory of change: I will get rich because I invest monthly. You are controlling that variable. You have the power to put money in every single month. If you are, then perhaps you will get rich. A weak theory of change, in contrast, is I will get rich because I feel like I should be. You're not taking the actions needed to get to being rich. The theory of change here is if you invest money consistently or you get a large return, then you will be wealthy. But if you don't, if you're not taking those actions and you're only looking at the big picture, you might not necessarily be rich. I think it's fair to say that most people don't get rich just by thinking about it, as great as that would be. A goal should be achieved if the logic behind the logic model is sound, essentially, wrapping all that up. Going back to the elephant theory of change, this would be an example of a logic model that was made from that pretty decent start of a theory of change. So elephant extinction prevention. This is just one example of what a logic model can look like. It's represented sequentially. This is the start, this is the end. To get to this given goal, you need to first start with activities, which then create output, which then create an outcome, and then can help achieve this organizational goal. Some of these activities to achieve this goal of saving elephants from extinction include creating sanctuaries for elephants to preserve their population, harsher punishment for poachers, more law enforcement to deter poachers, and then educating people about elephant endangerment. These really go down different branches. Think of this as a decision tree. Essentially, if you are helping animals repopulate or you want to decrease ivory poaching, these are two paths that you can go to take that. Both of these paths help to achieve this organizational goal. The output from these activities should be to preserve endangered elephants in terms of creating sanctuaries and less poaching from harsher punishment and more law enforcement, and less ivory demand if you educate people about elephant endangerment and what that really means for the ecosystem at large. So if we're just looking at all of these factors in this model, we have assumptions, we have external factors, and then we have the goal at hand. What are assumptions? It's what you expect to be true. What are external factors? Things that you can't control, but that you would like to happen based on your assumptions. So that's just one example of a logic model. But going into that, improving test scores in low-income communities, this is what a logic model could also look like. Again, it's represented sequentially, starting from the inputs all the way to the goal. It's represented in a different way, as opposed to vertically. It is horizontally, and then vertically, and then horizontally again. This is really only because there's only so much space that I can use here. However, I included inputs in this one. They're not necessarily needed at every point, but inputs, constraints, just what anything that you can do to improve your logic model and just make it as clear as possible, you should do. In terms of preventing rhino extinction, that's a much broader topic than improving test scores in a lower income community. But just starting with this logic model example, some inputs that you could do to really increase test scores would be more staff and more funding. That's what the organization and the program can do. That's what they can provide. And then this increased staff and this increased funding can fund or influence these activities to host study halls and provide free meals. If there's study halls and there's free meals, then perhaps there's an incentive for students to study more for these tests, especially in low-income communities where food scarcity might actually be an issue. Outputs. We get more study time, and you provide sustenance for students. And what do these outputs really influence? The outcomes. They can help to motivate students and remove barriers to studying. If someone has a hungry stomach, they're not necessarily going to be worrying about studying. And if they have more study time or even a scholarship, that's going to motivate students, or it should. That's really external, and we don't really have control over those actual outcomes, but logically they should be resultant. But obviously need to be tested with KPIs and followed up on. And then, as I said, our end goal is to improve test scores, and then we got this little A+ here as, just a little visual aid. So logic models, what you should gather from this, can take many forms. Logic models can be left to right only, they can be up and down, they can be left to right, down to left. It just really depends on how you want to represent it. But they should be sequential, and they should have not a lot of visual clutter and be very, very clear to easily communicate with stakeholders so that nobody really has many questions. Does your logic flow from the inputs to the goal at hand? That's really what you want out of a strong logic model. Now we're going to get into the wrap-up and the lead-up to the next unit. Project cycle assumptions. So essentially, realism drives the effectiveness of a logic model and of its assumptions. An assumption is any project factor that is true or certain without proof. We assume that because we go to the gym and we lift weights, that we will get stronger. This is really judged based on lots of previous research. It's just something that we can observe as a fact of life. It could be wrong in some instances, but it is generally true and certain without proof needed. Assumptions can be faulty, untrue, and or inaccurate. They don't always have to be true, but they should be true for the most part. Projects will realistically have many assumptions. There's a lot of moving parts. You might make a faulty assumption, but the more assumptions made, generally, the higher the probability of failure. This just goes back to basic engineering. The more points of failure there are, the more possibility of failure there is. So assumptions should be realistic for an effective strategy model, and you should minimize assumptions as much as possible so that you're not really going out on a limb to try to prove something that isn't necessarily concrete or drive some organizational change that isn't necessarily backed up by a strong theory of change. We're also looking at constraints. So in terms of constraints, thoroughness drives effectiveness. Constraints are any limitation on a project that is true in nature. So constraints include scope, quality, schedule, budget, resources, and risks. What can you put into a project that is limited? That is what a constraint is. An effective strategy model acknowledges all constraints. You have to really know what your shortcomings are, and your KPIs should really tie back to what your constraints are. Most projects don't have an unlimited budget. I can't really think of any off the top of my head. Even governmental projects have even if they have a large budget, it's finite in nature. It can be used up. So you have to really measure KPIs, Let's suppose we're looking at electric vehicle adoption in the United States. There can be incentives offered to purchase electric vehicles, but those incentives, they can be used up. So you really need to make sure that those incentives are being used adequately. Are they being abused? You really need to measure KPIs in order to measure that effectiveness of that policy. Then constraints subdivide into business constraints and technical constraints. A business constraint is a high-level constraint. It includes budget, resources, and timing. It's what managers have to deal with. Technical constraints are low-level details. For example, this slide's theme. This slide's theme, essentially the entire slideshow, was meant to fit this theme. It's not just free form, any shapes that can be in. It's a technical limitation. Suppose your team is working with Python or R, that might be a technical constraint. You need to use that as well. You need to fill this glass in this way, essentially. Now we're going to be looking at some discussion questions. So in review, why bother creating a logic model? Why are they useful? There could be a lot of answers for this, but you really need to tie it back to the stakeholders. How do stakeholders really benefit from a logic model? Why is a valid theory of change needed for a logic model? Answers could really range, but essentially a logic model is only as strong as a theory that backs it up. If you're looking at a logic model, it flows from the inputs all the way to the goals. But if the inputs and the actions don't actually line up with the goal at hand, then it's not going to be a successful model. It's not going to be a successful program. How do business constraints and technical constraints differ? Really, this is, at a pretty low level, but business constraints are essentially looking at what can managers control. Technical constraints are really what can you do with what you have at hand. So one challenge that I want you to tackle at the end of this, it shouldn't take too long, is create your own theory of change and logic model for a humanitarian or otherwise topic of your choosing. What assumptions and constraints will program managers need to consider? Recommended readings. There is the Logic Model Development Guide, which is really helpful to delving into even more of the nuances that I did not cover. A lot of the theory behind effective strategy models, essentially. The Impact of Fair Trade, a review of research evidence from 2009 to 2015 to see a really good example of a logic model, and to see another really good example of a logic model looking at transformational change, the challenge of a brave new world. What sort of theories of change can you really look for? What are the most effective ones? With that, that's really it. But in conclusion, strategy models help develop action plans by documenting goals and actions based on verifiable theory of change. Strategy models are useful for quickly communicating a project's activities, outputs, outcomes, and goals to stakeholders, and fully understanding the flow of a project from execution to expected results. You can see the shortcomings, you can communicate to each stakeholder. Those are really the key aspects of what makes up an effective strategy model. And strategy models are only as useful as their assumptions and constraints are accurate. And that's really all there is. Please tune in to the subsequent lectures and have a great day. Thank you.